Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this, our celebration of our 20th anniversary, and for this second panel, which includes some of the most exciting voices in the field, people who have not only made contributions to African American, African diasporic studies, but who are doing transformative work in what we think of as the more conventional disciplines as well. And I have to say that in addition to having learned so much from all of them on panels and reading their work, and in addition to their brilliance, I have to indulge myself and say they are also three of the flyest people you will ever see in the Academy. So they bring style and substance to everything. I want to say that Kiese Layman is not here. He was not feeling well this morning, and we want to wish him a very, very speedy recovery. His voice will be missed. We selected him because we wanted someone who was a working artist, engaged in the project of Black Studies and actually working in one of the, in the institution, because we think that should be a vision. The vision of African American Studies should embrace what artists bring to the table as well. So he will be missed. That's what he would have spoken about, but please keep him in your thoughts and send him healing thoughts and prayers and whatever meditations that we all do. So I'm going to introduce each of the panelists in the order in which they will be speaking, and you also have longer bios of them in your program. Professor Jafari Allen is Associate Professor of American Studies and Anthropology at Yale University. He is the author of The Critical Ethnography of Race, Gender, Sexuality, and Revolution, Venceremos, and I consider myself a Spanish speaker. The Erotics of Black Self-Making in Cuba. He's also editor of Black Queer Diaspora, a special issue of GLQ, a journal of lesbian and gay studies, and a number of other scholarly articles. He is currently working on a new book project, Black Queer Here and There, The Social Poesis of Diaspora, which traces cultural and political circuits of transnational Black queer desire in travel, art, and activism, and we're looking forward to that work. He will be followed by, and I should say he also is a Columbia PhD, right? So, one of our own. He'll be followed by Professor Alondra Nelson, who is a professor in the Department of Sociology and currently the director of the Institute for Research on Women and Gender here at Columbia. Her research focuses on how science and its applications may shape the social world, including aspects of personal identification, racial transformation, and collective action. Her most recent book is The Extraordinary Body and Soul, the Black Panther Party and the Fight Against Medical Discrimination. Every time I turn around, it's won another award, and those are listed in your program, and rightly so. Her next book, The Social Life of DNA, Race and Reconciliation After the Genome, traces how claims about ancestry are marshaled together with genetic analysis in a range of social ventures. And our final speaker will be Professor Imani Perry, who is professor in the Center for African American Studies at Princeton University. Professor Perry is an interdisciplinary scholar who studies race and African American culture using the tools provided by various disciplines, including but not limited to law, literary and cultural studies, music, and the social sciences. She is the author of More Terrible, More Beautiful. It says forthcoming here, but it's not forthcoming. It's out. I know. I teach it. It's required text in many of our courses. More Terrible, More Beautiful, The Embrace and Transcendence of Racial Inequality in the U.S., as well as Prophets of the Hood, Politics and Poetics in Hip Hop. She's published numerous articles in areas of law, cultural studies, and African American studies, and I should say she was also a beloved visiting scholar here at the Institute several years ago. So those are our panelists, and we'll start with Professor Allen. Thank you.
I'd like to, if you can see me, I'd like, just because I think that my position on this panel is to bask in the collective brilliance of this panel, and so I'd rather not get up. I just want to stay right here. So if you can see me, I'd ask that you just indulge me, because I don't want to leave this moment. And thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to be here. It's really lovely to be here in your company and to learn more from you in person again. And I'm going to read also because even though we may have a little more time, I'd like to stay a bit disciplined, even though what I have to say is not quite disciplined. Okay. So this meditation is called Black Queer Rhizomatics, Train Up a Child in the Way Z Should Grow, for Marcus, Jordan, and them. This meditation toward a critical and pedagogical agenda essays a re-narrativization for Black studies based on a commitment to an investment in radical Black queer feminist work. It's a remix based on 3 movements. The first and last are taken from what is essentially a love letter to my students whose courage, energy, and talent inspire me. The intervening or interrupting section is an attempt to say something about my current book project, which is also a chance to, again, have more discussion about the worlds Black folks inhabit simultaneously within and beyond the borders of the US, as Josh had directed me to do earlier this morning. Well, I will tell you, Audre Lorde never promised you a rose garden, or a crystal stair swept clean of tacks with no boards torn up, or places where there ain't been no carpet on the floor, bare. Rather, she and others have bequeathed a this or that, which promises only continued devastation and certain destruction on one hand, or possibilities, speech, pleasure, visibility, articulation, homemaking, joy, for example, on the other, which must be worked for and for which there are no guarantees. As enticement toward protracted struggle, Lorde offers the following. If we win, there is no telling. We seek beyond history for a new and more possible meaning. So, given the this or that, no guarantees, uninvited status of Black studies, today I'd like to again propose a few what-ifs. What if the now more than 40-year track record of Black feminist artistry, scholarship, and activism were taken seriously as the formative center of late 20th century and 21st century Black studies? What if normativity and respectability as modus operandi were taken up and taken back by Black studies, pushed forward and transformed? What if experimentation, affect, and futurity, some of the scholarly, artistic, and activist modes and methods of early Black knowledge and cultural producers, now repackaged as new and sexy and white, were taken seriously, that is funded, re-energized, and published, hired, and promoted in Black studies? What if all Black studies courses on the US South or on labor or religion use Johnson's Sweet Tea as a main text, or those who study African religious philosophy require students to grapple with Oshun's performativity and embodiment in the work of Oshun Joni Jones or Omisheke Natasha Tinsley? What if we learned and debated and taught distinctions between cisgender, transgender, femme, butch, bottom, and top, how this self-naming and negotiation of identity and behavior is highly contingent and interarticulated with race, color, and nationality, for example, in intro classes? Not only through the scholarly theorization of Matt Richardson and Enoch Page, for example, but also Sharon Bridgeforth's juke joint poetic theorizing of the men's, the women's, those who are both, and some who are neither. How might we transform our students' understanding of family by placing Mignon Moore's Invisible Families on the first-year African American Studies syllabus, or by continuing to explode business as usual US centrism of who gets to be Black and where, through emerging Black queer scholarship in and on Brazil, Trinidad and Tobago, Dominican Republic, New Orleans, Canada, and the French Department of the Caribbean, for example? The practice of attending to the abject or the deviant and the perverse incorporation of queer concepts and methodologies alongside topping or bottoming canonical Black studies authors and concepts constitutes another litany for survival and for thriving. I'm trying to say it plain and in the Black queer literary tradition. What if we rose to the demand of our complex now, which of course Joseph Beam would have called cold-blooded, or the brand of truth that Essex Hempel deemed ass-splitting? For Black queer work, the questions are thus related but distinct. Given increased visibility, articulation, and backlash, whether this project that Essex described as the creation of evidence of being powerful enough to transform the very nature of our existence, what are the conditions of possibility for beautiful and transformative Black queer work today? Where should we look for inspiration? To whom are we accountable? For the sake of space today, I will give you one answer outright. As Elzora said to Raz Baptiste in Eve's Bayou, look to your children. Remember that? In 3 years' time, you'll be happy again. Look to your children. Da. But anyway. In some respects, you don't know about Eve's Bayou. In some respects, Lord has already given us this utopic vision of work, love, and struggle, looking inward and outward at once, before, and after, seeking a now that can breed futures like bread in our children's mouths so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. What from the past must we preserve as we avail ourselves of opportunities that were literally created and necessitated by our dead and sick before us? We need not go as far back to enslavement to find the stony road we trod or bitter chastening. To draw only one example, Black gay men have indeed quite literally and fairly recently come into academia, into executive positions in community-based organizations, into libraries, think tanks, publishing, and punditry, treading our path through the blood of our slaughtered brothers, lovers, AIDS dead. The radical promise of Black queer work is located in scholarship, art, and activism that not only has a cellular and psychic connection to resistance to enslavement, but is also, quote, shaped by the burden of persistent colonialism and the euphoric promise of nationalism and self-determinism, end quote, by activist intellectual Black women who had analyzed the interlocking spheres of race, gender, sexuality, and class through the prism of anti-violence organizing. Poets, essayists, filmmakers, and organizers who had, in non-academic spheres and languages, called for Black men loving Black men as a revolutionary statement of self and community preservation. And moreover, had blocked city streets with their dead, tracing bodies and leaving their haunting presence on the streets as a sharp indictment of the callous state. Today, this same intellectual tradition and spirit is evident in a number of projects, including, to name just a few or extraordinary examples, the Schomburg Black, Gay, and Lesbian Archive, founded by Stephen Fullwood, the Mobile Homecoming Project and Brilliance Remastered, led by Alexis Pauline Gumbs, Marvin K. White's Making Tweets, Facebook statuses, and books out of ancestral wisdom, Sally Chem and her None on Record project, and the Caribbean Resource Network's recording and saving our histories so that they can be shared, analyzed, kept, and passed on rather than being passed on. Following this Black queer ethic of looking simultaneously back and beyond for ways through, higher, and deeper, a number of scholars, artists, and activists, too numerous to mention right now, continue to make significant contributions which could enrich your classrooms, reading lists, and students' lives. 2, Black queer here and there in medias res, once more again. It is true that the stakes are literally life and death for African-descended and African non-heteronormative and gender-varying individuals. Not only in the global South, which is often labeled a homophobic place at a time with the enlightened North, but also in developed industrial nations. Police violence, high and disproportionate incidence of HIV infection, cultural exclusion, and other forms of social suffering experienced by Black LGBTQ individuals globally inarguably demonstrates that marginalization in fact it's in fact compounded and intersectional. In many nations of the world, they face criminalization of sodomy and cross-dressing, the strategic silence of state apparatus apropos of their legal rights, and the need for targeted public health interventions, racist disenfranchisement, employment discrimination, and nationalist rhetorics which cast LGBTQ rights and recognition as from foreign, and attacks on tradition or sovereignty, for example. Nonetheless, Black LGBTQ or same gender-loving people are more than the calculus of their compounded vulnerabilities. The social does not only describe various ills or problems, but also contradictory forms of association, articulation, and assemblage expressed through dynamic process of poiesis. Thus, my new work, Black Queer Here and There, is a book about desire. Black desire for political empowerment or autonomy, for fun and carefree play in the face of social suffering, and Black erotic desire for one another. Black Queer Here and There takes translocality as both an analytic and a field site, tracing power and differential agency in the lives and texts of desiring subjects across borders of geography, nationality, class, gender, and citizenship. It moves beyond theorizing spatial relationships to grapple with the problematic of scholarly engagement and distance. That is, for example, the problem of writing from here about there, or how to most effectively be there for one's research subjects and political allies and fellow travelers. Moreover, this book challenges the temporality of diaspora, thought too often only in terms of a then, or what David Scott calls this memory, or this event, that memory. Taking up the project of radically reshifting blinkered narratives of Black and Black queer social life and culture, this work resignifies the disciplinary and theoretical apparatus of Black studies and social cultural anthropology. And in it, I try to resituate concepts of diaspora, autonomy, community, and desire as always already simultaneously here and there, and also potentially queer. It's based on 2 years of research tracing various routes of texts and bodies through field research in Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Brazil, Canada, Jamaica, and the US, and on the internet, and archival work at the Schomburg and in the Caribbean International Resource Networks and Digital Library of the Caribbean's online archives. This research pursued translocal Black and queer desire, cultural production, and social movement through what emerged in my research as three, what I call converging itineraries of interdisciplinary inquiry, representing various subjective motivations, scenes, and scales. And so this is the radically undisciplined part, because you're thinking, that's too much. There are too many scales. What does he do? This is, my argument will be, and I'm writing this now, is that this is life. And life doesn't happen on neat scales or in narrow disciplinary ways, right? The first line of inquiry traced visions of the transnational and contemporary Black queer art and film texts, internet porn sites, Facebook groups, and personal profiles. Can we glean a Black queer erotic or aesthetic from this mashup remix of the art of high cultural professionals and the artful practice of everyday life? When and where? The second itinerary constructs historical and contemporary case studies of local and translocal LGBTQ and HIV and AIDS community-based organizing and social movements. Here I'm asking, what are the most pressing, current, and recurring issues of local concern and advocacy? Is HIV/AIDS still the most globally salient issue among African-descended and African populations? What lessons can we glean from the dynamism of the issues pursued, methods employed, and the racial, ethnic, and class compositions of these activist projects operating in multicultural societies in which Blackness is at once vibrant, historically complex, and hotly contested on interpersonal and formal political scales? We observe transnational flows and friction in tourism and other forms of travel through the third itinerary. What, I'm asking here, are the ethics of travel and trade? What difference does it make when the tourist, traveler, or immigrant and the native share phenotype and history, perhaps ancient history, but may have disparate understandings of their economic and affective interdependence? And finally, which way toward a project of global political solidarity, global Black political solidarity? What are the ethics of international human rights activism? Another dimension of Jackie Alexander's charge to be fluent in each other's histories, and my aspiration to also become conversant in each other's fantasies and freedom dreams. The book argues that each one of these questions are currently assembling as what I call Black queer Afropolity. Ronaldo Walcott has already issued his reproof to what he calls the nation thing in the first generation of Black queer studies, and we could say the first generation and many streams of African American studies also. Calling the, quote, sexual textual economy, end quote, by which some US Black scholars have seemed unaware of or uninterested in engaging cross borders and unequal exchange, he writes, quote, what is at stake here is the ways in which some Black diaspora queers find African American queers, and that's African American with a hyphen. We were talking before about how to think about that. African American queers, yet the reverse always seems impossible. This admonition is well taken. Black folks and Black texts have never been limited by boundaries of nationality, but rather strategically and tactically deployed gender, color, class, and nation in a number of serious games. Even in place, Black queer subjects can hardly escape the transnational flow of Black desires. This has never been truer than in the current moment. Well-informed or with an intransigent ignorance of the other, Black queer folks continue to participate in global exchanges, whether with their bodies or merely a mouse click engaging their imaginations. Whether born there or returning on business or decidedly for pleasure, all of my respondents demonstrate particular strategies of what I call safer mobilities, to, from, and in between North and South. Paradoxically, these include ways to avoid misrecognition as a local or as a native by police and other state functionaries, and at the same time tactics to encourage recognition by Black and African descended local individuals as a solidary but respect-worthy and at times privileged diasporic subject or Black sister or brother. That is, the various itineraries followed here require careful translation and attention to anti-Black racism, transphobia, and homophobia, as well as heterosexism as real, but also not necessarily transparent or identical from place to place. Looking here and there from vantage points that have not been explored previously, I argue that transnational connections and disconnections are not characterized by false consciousness, but rather complexly laden forms of consciousness and political economy which determine what gets translated and received by whom and across what borders. The new scenes, often with very old scripts, of Black queer Afropolity provide exciting and potentially far-reaching new challenges and opportunities for scholars, artists, and activists. But we must be willing to take a new trip and to seek beyond history for something new and more possible. 3, this is the final. Let the children come. While scholarly work can give light to everyday resistance and survival by the most multiply vulnerable among us, or also the strategies of those with contingent privilege, I'm not naive enough to believe that it creates it. Rather, it helps to expand recognition of those sites as legitimate political expression and provides the basis for institutional support and recognition where needed. Still, teaching is clearly and incontrovertibly, I've said incontrovertibly twice, or inarguably, I'm just setting this up for y'all, I'm not arguing with y'all, this incontrovertibly a site, I just noticed that, and I'm argumentative here, a site in which we can do our work. In any event, it's my work to do where I am. After all, as poet Marvin K. White quoted to me, among our highest callings is to what he says, train up a child in the way he should vote, and when he is old, he will return it. Just one scene in the interest of time. For the mise-en-scène, picture school days. In the same Morehouse College classroom in which I sat more than 20 years ago, as a now retired sociologist warned her students about the supposed consequences of homosexuality in large block letters scrawled across the entire blackboard. Alienation from family, alienation from community, HIV, AIDS. My own story came full circle. Each week, my own class sat in the same place, John H. Wheeler Hall, to discuss normativity, sexuality, gender, race, pleasure, and ethics from the perspectives of Black LGBTQ experiences, theory, and artistry. Though I physically traveled to that classroom only a few times during the semester, holding most sessions via video conference from my office at Yale, I realized that my own identity as an engaged intellectual has been shaped by that early moment in the bad old days of imposed, non-protective silence. Morehouse students invited me to teach a course that would examine the sorts of exclusions and new community formations that I had experienced at Morehouse as a Morehouse student in the Atlanta community. The questions I asked in this class were, what interests are served by the erasure or sanitization of Black LGBTQ SGO people and their sexual and gender practices? What is at stake and for whom? Questions like these, in particular historical context, help us to approach Essex's ass-splitting truth. This is what Black queer pedagogy lays bare and builds upon. Among the range of final group projects that emerged from the course were a critical assessment of the general education requirements of Morehouse College through a content analysis of syllabi and interviews with students, which we have not released to the professors yet. That's going to be, I want my next invitation to Morehouse before we see how this happens. And reading it, I wondered how would all of our departments stack up if our students actually did this sort of thing to look at the syllabi and say, how does this reflect what this department or what the school is trying to teach us? Another was a report on media images of homosexuality in the Caribbean, and an opinion survey of attitudes toward bisexuality on campus, and a brilliant genealogy of the political and intellectual presence of LGBTQ students on the Atlanta University Center campus, derived from archives and interviews. Thus, in that class, and I hope for in a lot of the work that I do and the work that a number of us who do Black queer studies do, is to meet our goal to not only rigorously engage in critical social and cultural theory and interdisciplinary intersectional scholarship and art, but to contribute to the already exciting transformational evidence of being on campuses like Morehouse and Spelman, Clark, and Morris Brown. Like bread in our children's mouths, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. And if we win, there is no telling. We seek inward and outward, at once, before and after, at home, here and there, for the new, more possible meeting to come.
Okay, Felix. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Okay. So to begin, I want to thank Marcellus and Carl, the co-directors of IRAAS, as well as Sean and Sharon, who hold it all together, truly, and Farah and Carla for planning such a wonderful conversation this afternoon. And also, before I begin, I want to say happy anniversary to IRAAS, the place, IRAAS, the way of being and teaching, and IRAAS, the community that I'm so fortunate to be a small part of. So I'm going to talk today about I'm going to read some excerpts from my book, The Social Life of DNA, which will be out next year at this time. And the project begins as an ethnography, but as you see, it goes to lots of other places too. So this is a photograph that kind of suggests where I began. These are African-American genealogists at an annual meeting of the African-American Historical and Genealogical Society. It takes place in different cities all over the country. This one took place in New England in 2006. And these are some elders taking a course on DNA 101. So she's holding a double helix here. So this is where I began. But I soon found that these tests were going elsewhere. And so this afternoon, in the 20 minutes I have, I wanted to discuss with you briefly how and why insights and inferences from genetic science are being applied to US racial politics, particularly African-American cultural practices aimed at social repair and restitution, broadly conceived. So I'll discuss several activities initiated mostly by US Blacks who embark upon journeys to discover information about their ancestral origins with the aid of genetic inference, and who in turn propel this information into a plethora of social political uses. Reflecting more than the faddishness of all things genealogical today, although there's certainly that, plenty of that as you know, I argue that these endeavors illustrate how overconfidence in genetics has been annexed on to long-standing, unresolved, and persistent debates about American belonging. On the one hand, these efforts show how novel applications of genetic science may offer new avenues for social inclusion or social exclusion. On the other hand, these efforts reveal the stakes of the misplaced hope that scientific knowledge that is being used to stratify our human community into stubborn hierarchies of racial value can confirm identity, guarantee recompense, foster social repair, or engender justice. So when I began this research about a decade ago, I spent time with root seekers and genetic genealogists, and I initially set out to understand the extent to which race was being reconfigured from a social and political category to a biological one. Through these interactions, I came to see that we social analysts of race and genetics may in fact cede too much explanatory power to the science, and that other motivations are at play and are powerful in how genetic ancestry inference is taken up, and I've written a little bit about this. My work with genetic genealogists also revealed that concerns about racial reification, whether or not these tests are always reifying and making essentialist claims about race, while well warranted and necessary, did not begin or fully do justice to the myriad purposes to which DNA identification is being put. I began to see that there was indeed an unwitting genetic determinism to our own anti-racist science studies. For example, the fact that the Human Genome Project, that confirmed the overwhelming genetic similarity of human beings and then swiftly gave way to researchers' obsession with difference, is a central contradiction that serves as a starting point for much of our work on race and genetics, actually goes uninterrogated. The idea that the human genome gets decoded and a new racial regime sort of pops up or ensues is, I think, too pat an explanation for the dynamics that I've been uncovering over the last decade. So from this kind of temporal consideration followed another one, that the decoding of the human genome that we usually mark in 2000 was in fact actually the midpoint of an already evolving politics of race and science, not its inception. Thus, to use a phrase, as I do in the subtitle of my book, After the Genome, is not about the summer of 2000 when President Bill Clinton held a bilateral press conference with British Prime Minister Tony Blair to announce the scientific feat. Rather, we need to look back a decade or more to the conditions that precipitated the Human Genome Project, just as we look to its reception and completion. So I think an analogy might be to the approach that we use to thinking about race and genetics would be to sort of the equivalent of studying the civil rights movement beginning with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, right, as opposed to going back to the things that caused it to be. So this temporal shift is critically important because, as the sociologist Jenny Reardon has documented in her book, Race to the Finish, she details the kind of rise and fall of plans beginning in 1991 for what was called the Human Genome Diversity Project. And it was a campaign to, quote, sample and archive the world's human genetic diversity by gathering isolated populations in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. And these communities were defined by researchers as rare and valuable resources and obviously and clearly set off fears about biocolonialism. So going back to Jenny's work, what starts in 91 is another example of how the work of the Human Genome Project was always vexed by racial politics, racism, and a kind of genetic racial politics. So it's not, again, 2000, we get the genome, and thus we get these fears of particular types of racial politics. Indeed, the larger politics of the time are also important to consider. After all, the Human Genome Project was conceptualized in the late 1980s during the second term of a Reagan presidential administration that began its first term by declaring war on affirmative action. In Reagan's first months, an aide from the Civil Rights Division of his Justice Department would fan the flames of reverse racism, saying, quote, "We really make a mistake to try to cure discrimination with discrimination," close quote. And just a year later, President Reagan would famously say, echoing sentiment that would ring throughout his two terms, quote, "We must not allow the noble concept of equal opportunity to be distorted into federal guidelines or quotas which require race, ethnicity, or sex, rather than ability and qualifications to be the principal factor in hiring or education," close quote. So the emergence of this new genetic science was being developed in a specific historical and political moment as a form of racial ideology that Eduardo Bonilla Silva and others have termed colorblind racism was coming into strength. Although it has become commonplace to discuss the Human Genome Project as a signal achievement of the Clinton presidency, it was as much a vestige of the Reagan regime and the racial politics of that regime. And keep in mind that along with the sort of fanning the flames of racial discrimination, reverse discrimination, that Reagan swept into office on the wings of denunciations of the welfare queen, the undeserving poor, blaming the victim, right? So this is the context in which the Human Genome Project is launched. Moreover, this Reaganite shift in racial discourse diminished the potency of some earlier political tactics, and this is what the work that I'm going to talk about today, I think, tries to engage. This president, Reagan, oversaw the adoption of mandatory minimum sentencing laws and the so-called war on drugs, accelerating the largest expansion of mass incarceration the world has known. He also drove the stigmatization of activism, right? So, and that's one way I think we might think about the air traffic controller struggle as a sort of a stigmatization and a delegitimization of social activism. And he also began to develop this strategy, and this is all extending a strategy that he began as governor of California in the 1960s as its law and order governor. So thus, by the end of the 20th century, race was becoming, as Dorothy Roberts says, more significant at the molecular level, precisely as some declared it to be less significant in society. So what room for political struggle and what type of political struggle remains in such a context? Dorothy Roberts offers one answer when she writes in her book Fatal Invention that, quote, "Even some activists who oppose racism have adopted the view that race-based genetics and technology can be used as a tool," close quote. So, and Dorothy is quite critical of this, but actually I want to explore it rather than having an immediate normative response to it. So what we might call genetic politics is not a politics like any other, and I want to explore some of this. In part, it's because there are properties unique to DNA that make it uniquely deemed for suitability to truth claims, and also available simultaneously for claims both about the individual and the collective. So anti-racist actors using genetics as political leverage are not necessarily guilty of self-delusion. Rather, they find in DNA a tactic to advance some issues important to them in a political climate after the Reagan era, after the genome, that is increasingly chilly to demands for social equality and racial justice. As the sociologist Stephanie Greenlee, who's a student of mine at Yale, it contends extending Bonilla Silva's conclusion about colorblind racial ideology into the realm of political action. And Stephanie writes about the Gina 6 case, and she writes about the mobilization using technology in that mobilization. So she argues that today's social justice movements, quote, must now attend to their tasks in a context where erasures and silences on racism threaten to render the very basis of complaint invisible, close quote. So in short, combating colorblind racism requires first the restoration of color vision, the return to visibility of both historic oppression and contemporary inequality. It requires new insights. So as I will describe, in this moment, genetic analysis oddly, curiously, paradoxically, offers the unique and somewhat odd possibility of magnifying issues of inequality literally and figuratively at a microscopic level and bringing them into view. And after the social awareness is raised, inequities can be framed and attacked using strategies that might look like more traditional civil rights or Black freedom struggle strategies. So why turn to DNA for leverage in racial politics given the fraught history of scientific racism? One answer, I think, is because this is a small window of opportunity in a political terrain grown hostile to social justice demands. Thus, rejecting outright a reductive, essentialist understanding of race as a genetic fact does not and perhaps should not preclude exploration of the ways in which DNA analysis contributes to racial politics in the 21st century. Indeed, we need to keep open our curiosity about the new techniques and tools that are being used for the politics of a digital and genomic age if we're truly to understand what is transpiring. And again, I want to say I'm not making a normative argument or claim here. I'm not describing what racial politics should be. Rather, I'm trying to understand what they are. So the use of DNA analysis has become widespread, and diverse aspirations, interests, and ends are now sought through it. In addition to its diagnostic, forensic, and genealogical uses, genetics is increasingly called upon to arbitrate social and political issues. So the logic of DNA analysis, the centrality of the prism of heritability, to use Troy Duster's phrase, the privileging of molecular scale, the use of statistical methods, probabilistic algorithms, alongside genetic databases, are moving across and beyond their characteristic domains of biomedicine and forensic science into practices of self-fashioning, kin-keeping, and family formation, among others. So the double helix has wound its way into the nucleus of some of the most significant issues confronting US society, and I want to suggest today also confronting African American studies, Black studies, African diaspora studies. So DNA, this is just a slide also from the fieldwork in 2006. These are, they're holding up DNA molecules in this presentation, the same presentation. DNA is being applied today in endeavors that I call reconciliation projects, which are practices aimed at variously ameliorating the injurious repercussions of the past. With reconciliation projects, DNA analysis is incorporated in attempts to reunite formerly opposed parties or formerly unified ones, rejoining broken ties within a family, a community, a nation state, or a diaspora. It's used to uncover biographical or historical information that has been lost to the march of time or to adjudicate contentious issues. These efforts to repair damage caused by social and political struggles are undertaken in many arenas, including courts of law, laboratories, social justice organizations, and museums. While reconciliation signals the poignant public hearings in post-apartheid South Africa, or in Greensboro, South Carolina, here in the US, in which individuals bear witness to the traumas of racism and the other forms of rending of the social contract. In this work, reconciliation projects are in line with such initiatives, but I think they're distinct in that they include a forensic mechanism for getting at the truth of the past. So although reconciliation projects may include reparations politics, which I write about in one chapter of the book, or campaigns for state apologies, these are distinct types of social action. DNA is a critical component of these reconciliation projects. It's imagined both as technique and remedy. So this is a kind of, gives you a sense of the larger spectrum of what I write about, but I'm going to talk to you about one particular kind of genetic story today. So this is just the front cover of the Farmer-Pellman versus Fleet Boston reparations case that begins in 2002, and which by 2004 genetic ancestry testing is introduced. This is from that same, the bottom, genetic genealogy conference. There's an elder in period costume, and the gentleman with him is an African-American geneticist. And then there's Isaiah Washington's passport, which he carries around with him in his breast pocket, and I'll tell you more about that. So I've been studying for the last decade the company African Ancestry, which was started by Rick Kittles, who's now at a professor of genetics at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and they formerly had been at the University of Chicago, formerly at Ohio State. And this is part of what I do in the work is try to trace the company's representation of its products. So it started in 2003. This is how the front page of the webpage looked in 2004, certainly more kind of Afrocentric than it looks today, and I'll show you a different image. So African Ancestry, this is how it works in brief for those of you who don't know. After a root seeker has paid a fee, typically $99 to $500 depending on the company mails test kits to customers that contain the implements necessary to secure a DNA sample. The customer returns these to the company. The sample's amplified, sequenced, and then compared to, in this case, African Ancestry's proprietary database. It's a proprietary biobank. So you should know that, for those of you who are interested, African Ancestry and lots of other companies don't do their own DNA analysis. They sort of send it out. So in this case, they send it to the Sorensen lab in Salt Lake City. They receive the samples back as data, and then they compare the data to their own database. So African Ancestry's proprietary DNA biobank, the African Lineage Database, is said to contain more than 30,000 DNA samples from over 30 countries and 200 ethnic groups on the African continent. After several weeks, a customer will receive a results package, and you get effectively a certificate. This is someone named Robert Sampson, who's been linked to the Temne people of Sierra Leone. So as I've described elsewhere, novel selves and collectivities may be fashioned from these genetic ancestry tests. These new tests are paradoxically anchored in the past, and although the pursuit of roots is animated by contemporary individual yearnings, given the always communal nature of genetic information, they're also always about the past and the future, and they also always scale up from the individual to a heteronormative notion of the family, and again to the diaspora, also heteronormative in this rendering. Genetic genealogists actively fashion new identities from the genetic cloth supplied by African Ancestry. They then strategically shape their genetic results into usable paths that open up new avenues of present-day social interaction, including travel and civic engagement. So the formation of these DNA diasporas, or DNA networks, is illustrated by a project spearheaded by the Leon H. Sullivan Foundation, an organization with deep roots in the civil rights movement. So this is Leon Sullivan in the middle, and he's pictured there with Martin Luther King Jr., and he was a little bit older than King and the sort of civil rights movement leaders, but it's an important figure. So his foundation, the name for him, is a nonprofit organization that was formed before his death in 2001. Sullivan was known, as many of you probably know, as a crusader for racial equality. And he was also a Baptist preacher. He was a preacher by the age of 17. By 18, he was a pastor of 2 churches. He served in ministry in West Virginia, but he's most notably known for being a central figure in Philadelphia. So he would write in his biography, Build, Brother, Build, that he was dedicated to the, quote, problems of the community and did all that he could to assist colored youth with their employment opportunities, as well as scholarships and other educational programs. And this was so let me move ahead a little bit in the interest of time. And by 1963, as pastor of the Zion Baptist Church in Philadelphia, he had launched Opportunities Industrial Centers, which provided job skill training. And by the 1960s, there were more than 75 of these centers across the US. So that's part of his life. But he's also been widely hailed for his ingenuity in creating economic opportunities on the African diaspora. On the board of General Motors, he led an effort to get the company, which had business interests in South Africa and was the largest employer of blacks there, to divest from the country until the apartheid regime had ended. And he was known as part of this effort for developing the Sullivan Principles in 1977, an explicit anti-apartheid effort that established ethical egalitarian codes for how non-white workers should be treated in US-based multinationals conducting business in South Africa. So in another passage in his autobiography, Sullivan talks about his calling, his kind of prophetic calling to do work in the diaspora. So he writes, I had heard and heeded a call from God and from Africa and from African Americans and others of the black diaspora to at least try to unite people of African heritage with Africa, to make a link, to build a bridge. And so this is the logo of the Leon Sullivan Summit, which has this bridge here that he imagines in his kind of prophetic dreams for his diaspora work. And notably, the bridge just connects two landmasses on the world, the US and the continent of Africa. So beginning in 1991, the Leon Sullivan Foundation inaugurated biennial gatherings of elites from across the US and the African continent called the Leon Sullivan Summits. These gatherings consist of dialogues between politicians, bureaucrats, and business leaders from varied African countries with their American counterparts. Prominent attendees to past summits have included George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, who's the honorary co-chairman of the board, of the Leon Sullivan Foundation, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, and the Reverend Jesse Jackson, as well as business leaders such as Paul Wolfowitz, the former World Bank head. So at the 8th Sullivan Summit meeting, which took place in Arusha, Tanzania in June of 2008, there was a sort of turning point in how Sullivan, those working in Sullivan's legacy, imagined the bridge that he had prophesied. On this occasion, the diasporic connection that Sullivan had fostered for decades was transformed from an imagined transnational community based on shared historical experience into a bridge across the Black Atlantic soldered with selected biological ties. At the close of the summit, the participants, which included the African-American actor and genetic genealogist Isaiah Washington, approved a resolution to formally recommend that US blacks purchase DNA testing through African ancestry. These root seekers were then encouraged, but not required, to embark upon philanthropy and economic development projects in the countries to which they were genetically matched. So that's the resolution there about the encouragement. This is the website for the 2008 meeting. You'll notice at the bottom the co-sponsorship with the African Ancestry Company. Isaiah Washington, who learned of his maternal affiliation with the Mende community of Sierra Leone in 2005 via African ancestry, would by 2010 become one of the small number of US citizens to be granted dual citizenship in that country, and would become the first person ever to do so based on genetic genealogy. So this Leon Sullivan Foundation initiative offers one example of how genetic genealogy is being used to fix what was broken by slavery, transforming conceptions of diaspora and nationalism in the process, as well as a particular instance of how the call to link DNA testing to development and philanthropy is being taken up by Black Americans. Okay. So this is back to Isaiah's passport. So I'm going to tell you about a moment in 2010 where I actually took this photograph of his passport because he carries it. So I encountered him. I've encountered him many times, so I encountered him on this occasion in the fall in Atlanta at a conference I'm going to tell you about, and he carries it around with him wherever he goes. So I attended the Leon Sullivan Foundation's Global African Reunion in Georgia in the summer of 2010. So the summits happen biennially. In alternative years, they have events in the U.S., usually around the time of the UN meeting. So there's lots of African delegates and politicians in the U.S. So I attended the Leon Sullivan Foundation's Global African Reunion in Georgia in September 2010. It was here that I learned in a public reveal ceremony, standing alongside two other African American women, that I shared ancestry with the Bamileke people of Cameroon. Rick Kittles presented my results to me, along with his business partner Gina Page, and Isaiah Washington, the evening's MC, beside him. Our three reveals, we three African American women, were the opening act. Gina Page announced the DNA results of the two other women on stage with me, and they were visibly moved by the news that at long last, they had concluded this particular stage of their pursuit of African ancestry. My presentation was the last one. Paige, who like Kittles was well aware of my ongoing research on their company, turned the microphone over to her partner. I was not sure if this was because of the two of them, I know Kittles better, or for some other reason. Waiting to hear my results, I was worried that my skepticism of the technology would be apparent to the audience and would ruin the experience of genetic revelation and African redemption that they had paid to enjoy. The headliner, so we were the opening act, the headliner were the reveals of the sons of Martin Luther King Jr. and Marcus Garvey. Those would occur in the same Atlanta ballroom later in the evening before the same expectant crowd that included the actor Rockman Dunbar, former Atlanta mayor and United Nations Ambassador Andrew Young, representatives from the administration of Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan, numerous African expatriates, and many, many African Americans. I would later learn that King and Garvey had taken the test and received the results long before this evening, so unlike me, they already knew what their results were. So this is, okay, so that's Rick Kittles. That's Hope Masters, who is the daughter of Leon Sullivan, who sort of carried on his foundation until very recently, where they got in trouble with sponsoring one of their summits with the sponsorship of an African despot. This is Martin Luther King III, and this is Gina Page, African ancestry, and Isaiah Washington. This is the man with the gray hair is Julius Garvey, who is Marcus Garvey's son, who is a retired cardiac surgeon who lives on Long Island. Not his grandson, not his nephew, but his son. 5 minutes, okay. Getting his results from Rick Kittles. As the scions of historic race leaders, the participation of Martin Luther King III and Julius Garvey made patent the social justice and social repair motivation of this evening. Yet on this night, there were no exaltations of up, up, you mighty race, as Marcus Garvey famously encouraged his UNIA followers. There was no overt expression of a renewed vision of equality as articulated by King in his well-known fiery I Have a Dream speech. The DNA test revelations played out as a 21st century legacy of the civil rights tradition, but as a new racial politics, although what kind of politics this was, if any, remained unclear. These reveals lacked both Garvey's organizational structure and Black nationalist vision. Also, they lacked King's prophetic egalitarianism. Indeed, the prevailing vision on offer this night, through a large projection of Leon Sullivan brandishing an African passport that loomed over the ballroom stage, and Isaiah Washington's wielding that night of his own recently acquired Sierra Leonean passport, was one of escape. The Global African Reunion encapsulated the vexed nature of reconciliation projects, which are simultaneously atavistic and futuristic. On the one hand, this event conveyed that the racial reconciliation, recompense for past injustice, and diasporic reunion, the resolution of past yet persistent matters, had been reimagined as a technical issue of the highest order. These were cutting-edge solutions to age-old injustices and yearnings, an attempt at new tactics for new times. The pursuit of boldly construed historical and social repair that undergirds reconciliation projects has been described as a kind of politics of the past. Sociologist John Torpy, in fact, cautions that, quote, our visions of the future may have been extensively supplanted by our preoccupation with the past, close quote. This social excavation, Torpy argues, is a lamentable political exercise that focuses on writing the past at the expense of advancing an idealized vision of the human future. Yet what is distinguishing about reconciliation projects like the event this night is precisely their combination of historical reckoning and future orientation. This futurist bent is embodied in the genetic science and in the action to which DNA identification is put. In other words, these projects are about the use of genetic technologies as well as genealogical aspirations for what the knowledge of the past may bring today and tomorrow. Future promise, anthropologist Mike Fortune reminds us, is, quote, an radical feature of genomics, close quote, be it a supposed crystal ball about disease and offspring or a science fictional lens on the Black world to come. Often oriented in the past, reconciliation projects are driven by the desire to effect change in the past, in the present, and shape a distant future. Through its futurity, social power, and novelty, genetic science promises to open up new capacities for political possibility, rather than necessarily curtailing them by dwelling in the past. It was vividly evident to me, as well as those sitting with me in this Atlanta ballroom, that we shared the conviction that we were living and performing a different kind of racial politics. In this new time, genetic science can be friend or foe. It can exonerate or convict. It can lead the way back to Africa, as was the case with Garvey's son, so his reveal went to an African ethnic group, or it can underscore the bittersweet European ancestry of many blacks in the US, as was with the case with Martin Luther King III. Yet as I was poignantly congratulated by countless strangers that evening for having recovered my African ethnic identity but felt no differently, I was keenly aware of how deeply symbolic and perhaps solely symbolic this experience was. At the same time, I was very conscious of the fact that DNA holds not only the molecular building blocks of life, but also some of our highest aspirations for ourselves, our families, and our communities. But what ultimately did I as an individual and this transnational audience gain from these 5 public roots revelations? What might be the consequences of genetic mediation of African diasporic cultural politics that have historically involved social movement tactics and civil rights organizations? Indeed, what does the genetic annexation of long-standing cultural aspirations and political struggles suggest about the horizon of racial politics in the US? Civil rights organizations and racial justice groups such as the National Urban League, which is in another chapter, the Sullivan Foundation, the Organization of Tribal Unity, which is another chapter, and the Descendants of the African Burial Ground are turning to genetics to accomplish goals formerly pursued through grassroots organizing, electoral politics, and moral suasion. However, efforts to reclaim original identity, while psychically beneficial, fail to significantly address contemporary structural inequality. In the same way that the scientific and therapeutic applications of DNA research have failed to live up to expectations, reconciliation initiatives bring their own technical, institutional, and political limits into stark relief in the very practice of them. The trajectory of each of these reconciliation projects that I write about in the book suggests that ultimately, equality, rights, and ethics are not easily tethered or readily settled with DNA evidence. Moreover, the current preoccupation with the genetic resolution of reconciliation projects may contribute to the decline of already corporatized and waning civil rights activism, the further slide of citizenship prerogatives into consumption practices, and the transposition of justice into scientific technique. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me begin by saying it's wonderful to be here and be part of such a rich and exciting panel, and I think there will be some really interesting intersections between the concerns that all of us share. Okay, so I think that part of what I'm always trying to do with my work is to imagine futures. Or at least dwell in the terrain of my imagination in terms of what I'm trying to create. In my first book, I was imagining a way of understanding how to have an art criticism of hip-hop in light of both how subject it was to market forces and consumerism, and also with an awareness of its deep political subject matter, deep politics in the subject matter. And my second book was an effort to understand the persistence of racial inequality through diffuse yet accumulating social practices by bringing the social sciences and the humanities together, and it was as much a methodological exercise as it was the pursuit of a particular question. In order to understand the landscape of race, and in some sense I was trying to imagine the kind of intellectual community and methodological innovations that I think of aspirationally in terms of what we will pursue in African American studies in this next phase. And currently I'm working on 2 projects, one of which I'll talk about. The first is a book on the cultural history of the song Lift Every Voice and Sing, but through the study of this particular artifact, I'm developing an approach to thinking about formalisms in African American culture as very distinct, though at moments overlapping category with things like respectability, which is a term that I think in the future we have to both hone and treat with a little bit more care. And with this book, which is titled Vexy Thing, I'm trying to imagine a future in which I can stick with the label feminist. Okay. So at the beginning of law school, I learned about the reasonable man standard. The reasonable man is dispassionate and measured, and every man of sorts, but not really, because he appears not to be burdened with the urgencies caused by poverty and desperation. His gaze is the traditional standard for legal decision-making. We learned in law school that in time this standard was no longer gender-specific, and the law itself has expanded in various ways to include women and people of color and a panoply of different sorts of others. For some, this seems to be enough, a pathway towards emptying out the reasonable one of his identifying traits, making him truly neutral. But he haunts me. Colin Dian's recent work, The Laws of a White Dog, has helped me understand part of why, underneath the model citizen for whom the law is made, there are others being unmade. There are non-persons. In other words, while the reasonable man was being concocted in American law, the slave was too. Today, the person emptied somewhat of his nominal whiteness and maleness, and the non-person sit at opposite ends of the spectrum of power. In the same configuration, the person is protected and rights-bearing. The non-person is shielded from the view of persons by prisons and detention cells and non-documentation of various sorts, and oceans and veils of ignorance. And then there are the partial persons, the ones who were once appendages to, attached addenda to the reasonable men, some rights, some freedom, but always secondary surplusage. And this is important terrain, all of this is important terrain for gender thought. And part of the, one of the things that I think illustrates this is, right, as I've been going back through rereading Foucault as I'm writing, he doesn't really deal with non-persons, right? He deals with persons who have failed to be the ideal citizens, but they are presumptive citizens. That's part of the biopolitics, but there's actually a whole terrain of human beings who were never thought to be potential citizens. So when Hortense Spillers and Colin Dian talk about vestibularity and non-personhood, we actually have essential information about the human community that certain branches of critical theory have failed to fully acknowledge. So this book begins with a rather simple contention. The reasonable man is also the patriarch, and he remains our primary unit of citizenship and rights. However, the physical form of that particular subject is no longer limited to the cis white male body. Right? There are people of various hues and bodies and histories who can occupy that space. And this is what we take to be the great gain of both the women's movement and independence movements and civil rights movements, right? But none of this resolves the haunting. The reality of partial persons and non-persons finds new forms today, and there's no sign of these statuses waning. In fact, they seem to be increasingly codified and obscured simultaneously. It is gender that I'm taking up as the lens through which to see this architecture of power, and this is in part because gender I conceive of as the or inequality. Other inequalities that are systematized and essentialized in the West find their logic in the logic of gender, right? So that colonialism and slavery both depend in part upon an ideology naming othered men as insufficiently reasonable, guided by passions and bruteness, masculine but of an undeveloped sort, as failed men. Women who were othered were failures as well, ambiguously gendered, cast into chattel-like conceptions of gender and or flexibly gendered. Women in public, poor women, also were failures for not fitting the code of women in the household. And at the same time, the ladies of the household had a fixed role, idealized and yet marginalized, possessed of a power that was only ancillary, that which accrued from the patriarch. In mainstream feminism today, despite all of the work that has been done, we hear endless discussions that are really all about grappling between the patriarch and the lady, particularly with respect to those who own the biggest plantations, symbolically speaking. Efforts to move us out of the house through feminist of color thought, Marxist feminism, queer theory, trans theory have been frankly ghettoized, despite the fact that they collectively represent concern for a large majority of the world, while patriarchs and ladies are a small, albeit powerful group. This should not be, and we need more room. So what does it mean to recuperate a feminism that orients itself around thinking about how gender ideas shape power relations, and then interrogates the persistence of this inequality through such an understanding? And that's the primary question of the book I'm working on. And on the pages, I'm making an argument for a particular feminist analytic that is a way of analyzing inequality, injustice, and inhumanity through the historic and lingering distributions of power that were created by means of gendered ideals. And while I am as concerned as evinced by previous work with racial injustice and economic injustice, I find gender to be a particularly generative lens because it has a logic that remains so explicit in our supposedly post-feminist world. So basic human ideas about things such as emotion, care, weakness, strength, defense, security, rationality, valor, violence, purity continue to be explicitly gendered and used to structure our values, codes, and laws. Gender has been a binary construct by and large, at least in the West, and repetitions of binaries used for marking essential difference and distribution owe a debt to gender constructs. So throughout the book, I talk about two tools that are used to shape and sustain this unjust world in the context of gender: force and word. And force, as meant literally as in terms of violence and destruction, and making sort of simple observation, for some of us, encounters with violence is a rare occurrence, and for others it's quotidian. It occurs in both intimate and public spaces and is wrought by both intimates and strangers. And its companion word is presented as an epistemological rubric, and so following Naomi Mezzi and Robert Covert, I understand law as a word, as a form of word that displaces the use of force with its authority, but depends upon force as its enforcer, right? And this term is influenced by Foucault as well, but I'm interested in words like laws that are enforced, which have particularly heightened power among all the various discursive trends we live with, so that even as discourses fall into patterns, I would say that the sedimentation of neoliberalism with its various marketplaces of ideas has made it harder to identify kind of single social values that mistreat, that are part of dominant discourses. So for example, we might distinguish between a kind of historic account of deviance that casts people to the margin, the notion of deviance, from a present moment where there where we both have a discourse around deviance, but we also have a discourse around sex positivity, right? Or that even the fact that we have both anti and pro-porn self-described feminists. So there's these sort of competing ideas about what certain constructs and terms themselves mean. And so in this sort of motley of discursive flows, I argue that we look to the intersection of force and law, both formal and informal, to see where disproportionate human suffering or casting people into non-personhood takes place, right? So that some people are being routinely beaten, murdered, and raped in ways that the law would deem, if not, would deem either consensual or off the grid of law enforcement. And that's where I want us to be attentive, that it is not simply sort of a question of the term, but where the terms intersect with force. So we have force in the word, and we also have neoliberalism and hypermedia. And that brings me to a central problem that I pursue, which is also what I call the problem of representation. And part of the argument there is I think we ought to have growing skepticism towards representation. Gender representation or gender and representation in media, scholarship, and in politics, right? So that representatives are part of the currency of neoliberalism to produce the appearance of inclusion. And so they might actually appear as advocates or as proxies, but they might not. And I'm also skeptical of representation in terms of media and image. So there's a certain kind of fixation on having moments of history or experience represented, and I have been thinking about this a lot with 12 Years a Slave. And I want us to have increased care about this because we have this impulse to pursue a kind of witnessing and deep knowledge about representation, and yet that seems to be a kind of historically unsophisticated approach, given that we know enough about what people are capable of witnessing to know that seeing it might not transform them into anything decent, right? So removal from stories and encounters with the violence, both historical violence and contemporary violence, can destroy the ways in which sort of we indulge in fictions of innocence, and that's important in terms of challenging national mythos. But really, even a witness can consent to evil who thinks they're a decent person can consent to evil, right? And we have traveled down the kind of slippery slope from actual witnessing of brutality to the necropolitics and back. And so the issue to me is not the question of whether we actually see a representation that allows for a certain kind of witnessing, but our capacity for intimacy and reckoning. And I think this is what the creative realm provides. I think it sets the stage for insisting upon intimacies, and it subverts power in doing so. And so throughout the book, I'm using literature and art, and some examples would be the Morrison's Song of Solomon, 12 Tribes of Hattie, The God of Small Things, Wangechi Mutu's paintings, to travel this road of kind of creating an analytic that will provide a sort of model. So I go through the works of art and then try and think about how then we apply what they offer to actual real politic. And so I'll talk a little bit about just about the analytic, really and I'll try to do that pretty quickly. And specifically, I'm drawing here on the concept of the passionate utterance that philosopher Stanley Cavell develops, and he explains that this idea of the passionate utterance is an extension of J.L. Austin's concept of the performative utterance, which is really important for gender theory and Butlerian gender theory in particular, right, which is essentially a statement intended to lead to some conventional outcome according to appropriate procedures, such as with this ring I thee wed. Right? And literary theorists and cultural studies scholars have done a great deal of exploration of the performative utterance already, but I'm really taken by Cavell's extension with the passionate utterance for a couple of reasons. The passionate utterance is an apropos expression for outsiders to conventional forms of recognition because it's a form of invitation for which there is no conventional procedure to produce a particular effect. So the speaker uses emotion to assert standing before the one who is being spoken to, and doing so vulnerably and yet also with an assertive demand. And so he describes the passionate utterance as an invitation into the disorders of desire, which I love, to something possible but not probable. It is an invitation to acknowledge and respond to that which cannot be ensured or expected according to rules, laws, and mores. And I see this emerging from Black women's creative and intellectual traditions all over the place. And so I'm moving to examples of this. And this is also in part comes from the way in which I've been taken for years, and will probably spend my entire life taken with Hortense Spiller's concept of vestibularity, because on the threshold, one chooses, if there is a choice, right? But there's this possibility of entry or exit, and how to enter or exit. But there's also a kind of simultaneous deep vulnerability and interpretive possibility, right, on the threshold. And the creation of alternative grammars that I see in the literature and the art for the moral universe, in these kind of moral universes of novels and musicscapes and visual landscapes, is also an invitation to an alternative set of understandings, right? It's a turning away from the threshold to build something anew. And to me, most importantly in these works, the alternative grammars refuse any possible reduction of the moral claims of the novel to mere requests for political inclusion on the terms of the Western nation state. And I think this is important because a politics that is rooted in seeking recognition on some level requires constant analogy to the way things are and constant disciplining. That's the way the law works, right? To recognize the frames must be familiar. We must prune human subjectivity into existing conventions. And I think there's a kind of skepticism that we see in the works of art that I think we ought to embrace in our political lives as well. To me, it's inspiring as an approach, and the reason I want to take it up in politics is because I think it means that we approach the world with fresh eyes, but we also get back to the practice of having politics that exists beyond the realm of the doctrinal and the partisan. So we take positions on those things, but politics are conceived of as part of identities, prospectively, and I want to use there a notion of identity that's old-fashioned, right? So it's not identity as fixed ascriptive category, but actually as a product, at least at the first time that you develop identity as a product of adolescent development, but hopefully something that we develop through lifetimes where we look around the world and we try to find which communities we respond to and see ourselves with, both literally and figuratively, in ways that allow us to develop as individuals, who create meaningful lives. So I'm going to stop there. I could talk more about the literature, but actually I'm eager to get into discussion. Thank you.
I want to thank all of our speakers. I just am sitting here so excited about the work that they're talking about, wanting to read it and learn from it, and I hope you got a sense of the wide range of possibilities under this rubric that we call African American Africana Studies, especially as we look forward. I think one thing that I heard through all of these papers was reminding us of a sense of possibility, not just foreclosure, right? And also forcing us to rethink some of the ways that we've inherited thinking about what it is that we do, forcing us to rethink what we think the natural outcome of the work that we think we do. And all of the projects were just so extraordinarily creative. And the word that came to mind as I was listening to them was kind of a dazzling intellect, a kind of dazzling intellectual project before us. So I want to open it up for questions. We have lots of time, that's just good. We have more than 15 minutes, so let's just open the floor. Carl.
Nice presentations. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Oh, a microphone, yes, okay.
Nice presentations. Outstanding job. Alondra, I just have a quick question about the ballroom and those spaces.
Mm-hmm.
When you are somewhat skeptical in those spaces, do you share your concerns with the folks there, and are they receptive, are they aware, or is this news to them?
Oh boy. So I'll answer, but Jafari might answer, Jacqueline Nasty-Brown is here. It's kind of an ethnographer's dilemma, that question actually gets at the core of the ethics of what you do. I mean, by the time I had done that field work, I had already published a few pieces about the ethnography already, and I didn't want to, I felt emotionally I didn't want to ruin the event, and so I felt like I had to give some, the women next to me who had spent their money to pay for, I used research funds to pay for my test, they had paid for their test, they were, probably working class, and, it wasn't, and I felt like I didn't want to ruin their experience, and then you had this expectant audience of 200 or 300 people, and I didn't want to ruin that. So, but I also didn't want to behave in a way that I thought was unethical for myself. So I didn't do anything that didn't feel true to me. I mean, I was, but I couldn't also do the quivering, teary-eyed, because there's lots to be skeptical of with the technology, but I'm not skeptical of the power of its social work, or the things that people think it can do in the social world for them.
A hand here, and then
I just have a follow-up question about that. I'm Deborah Beetza from City University of New York. Where does your skepticism about the technology come from? What is the basis of being skeptical about the actual technology? I can certainly understand your skepticism about the use of the technology and the social meaning of the technology.
I'm not skeptical about that at all, actually.
Okay, I guess my question is, what's the skepticism about the technology?
Because these are fully constructed categories. So what is it genetically does it mean to be Bamileke or Cameroonian, right? And that the sort of implication is that the tests are telling you what your pre-middle passage identity is. Yet these countries didn't exist before colonialism. That, even if you share the exact same sort of set of markers with someone who is a Bamileke in Cameroon today, that we don't know anything about. So even assuming that connection is true, which is very complicated connection, is it just one person? Is it one person who happened to be there, who traveled from somebody else and calls himself Bamileke? I mean, our identifications as African American, Jamaican, they're very complicated. And so while I accept, and Rick Kittles often says this, that it's more information that people might be able to garner through other means, particularly those of us who don't have a kind of paper record of our genealogy. Technology is very complicated, or very, not complicated, it's not the word I would use. It's not, you can't verify it. The databases are proprietary. There's no, if you send your same sample to another company, you'll get different results. The test results often come back with things like, I write about one woman I interviewed who got inferred to be matched to Equatorial Guinea, but that same marker was found in Mozambique. I mean, that's like thousands of miles away, you know. So I'm far more skeptical about the technology than I am about the truths that people think that they're doing and, you know, what they think they can do in the world with the tests.
Well,
Okay.
we could have a debate about that, but I'm not going to go there.
I actually don't think it's debatable. I mean, I'll let me give you the citation for my science article about the technology, but that was in Science.
Okay, Mawala?
Hello. I also have a question about the DNA research. And I just wanted to know if you could say a few words. I don't know if that's something that you've been thinking about, but this paradox in the development of this global Black or African identity, this diasporic transnational identity, that is contradicted by strictly defined nationalities, African nationalities that divides Africa by using the nation state that has been, you know, that is supposed to be not making sense in the Americas. Why does it make sense on the African continent today? So I was just curious to hear what you had to say.
I mean, some of the answer is in the very things that you say, and I write a little bit about this in the book. I mean, some of the identities are national identities, some of them are ethnic identities, and you know, these are identities that are made available to wealthy African Americans, right? And so it's a kind of, you know, it's a very, I think vexing, since Imani put vexy thing on the table, it's a very vexing 21st century kind of rendering of how we've thought about African diaspora politics. And Josh earlier was talking about the, what word he used, but the inequality in diasporic resources, which is Professor Brown's phrase, diasporic resources. And I use her work in my work as well. I mean, there's profound inequalities both in how people imagine themselves, and there's a kind of sense of, there's even a kind of, you know, neo-colonial kind of extraction from Africa, you know, that you're getting these kind of symbolic resources from Africa to kind of bolster our American middle class, African American middle class identities. So it's, you know,
Yes, here.
Hi, my name is...
Oh, wait for the microphone. Sorry. He's getting a workout.
Hi, yes. Is it on? Can you hear me?
You have to speak.
Hello?
Yeah, there we go.
I'm William Pruitt. I'm a first year in the comparative lit department here. My question is also about the DNA test. I was wondering if you could, the British law firm Lede recently won a lawsuit on behalf of Kenyan people who are still living and who had suffered torture at the hands of colonial forces during the rebellion for Kenyan independence.
Mm-hmm.
And that law firm is now interested in taking up a case on behalf of
the CARICOM?
Yes. And I was wondering if you could talk about the implications, more specifically, I was wondering if you could anticipate the problems of using this kind of DNA research in efforts to repair the damages wrought by the slave trade throughout the world.
So I'm going to punt this to Imani because she's the law expert. I mean, I can tell you what happened in the U.S., which is a different court system. It's a different, you know, type of law. So in the U.S. case, the court says that the 7 or 8 plaintiffs who are bringing the reparations case in the U.S. instance don't have standing. And so basically the court is saying you can't prove through a genealogy of capital and a kind of pedigree genealogy that you are the injured party. And so they say, we're going to go to Rick Kittles. And so Kittles is a big figure in my book because he imagines himself as a black nationalist activist. And so Kittles had had a friendship with Deidre Farmer-Peelman, who's the lead plaintiff at George Washington, where they were both graduate students and they were both involved in black nationalist politics on campus. So she goes to Rick and says, you know, they're saying we can't prove that we're the descendants of Africans. And so they submit genetic African ancestry tests as evidence. And the court again says that it doesn't prove standing, and there's a kind of decision that parses this fine line between genetic ties and genealogical ties that I write about. But it completely fails in the U.S. case, and so what's more interesting is the fact that they try to use, that they feel like this is their kind of next move on the chessboard in the response to the court in a moment. So in 2004, the test had just only been out a year. The company had only been selling the test for years. So I don't know if something like that can happen in this case, and I also don't, I don't know enough about British law, and I haven't carried what's going on with the CARICOM, because it's actually, they say they might sue, but there's not actually, is there a suit yet?
I don't know. I don't know about this, and I don't know about English common law either, so it's not an area of expertise. Although, I just one of the things that I think is interesting is the resort to litigation as a remedy for these kind of historic injuries is really problematic in limited, but it also shows, I think, a contraction of a kind of political imagination where that becomes that it's seen as worthwhile pursuing because it is the way to have a public conversation about the issue, even in cases where it is clear that it's very unlikely that there'll be a remedy.
Thank you.
Oh, here, and then Rich, so you first.
Thank you. Hi, this follows up on that. My name's Sonia Pasmentier. I teach English at NYU. And I wanted to ask, I was struck in the image from the Leon Sullivan website about, I think it sort of says, for those of you who haven't been able to establish your citizenship in various African countries based on law, here science can do that for you. And so that seemed to speak to me to the limitations or possibilities of different disciplines, which I think all of you are speaking to in different ways. So this is kind of an open question, but I just kind of would like to hear you reflect on that in relationship to your own work, because Imani, you sort of talked about the possibilities of the literary, and Jafari, you were talking about kind of the limitations of disciplines in a larger sense. So I wonder, maybe in both a public context and a kind of institutional academic context. Is it too late?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't have an immediate thought either, but it seems like something that I ought to think about.
We like those kind of exchanges.
Yeah, we do.
One thing I think to think about, and this is actually, I actually would really defer to both of you, but your question registered as raising these questions about citizenship and transnational movement and access to places and the sort of and being a member of the elite, and I guess so this is, this becomes the source of a kind of a part of the kind of skepticism I have, because there's a sense of possibility that is quite reserved, it's quite limited, right, in terms of who gets to experience certain kinds of mobility and actually to gain something, to experience that without huge loss, right? So that lots of transnational movement actually entail, for most of the world, entails certain kinds of loss and sacrifice, right? And there's a complicated sort of set of exchanges, but the kind of class-based access this, and that was actually the question that I had for you, Alondra, which was just to ask you to talk a little bit more about the class dimension and
the
imperialism, which you guys But and then I don't know if that resonates with your work in terms of movement, what you were talking about.
Yeah, it certainly resonates with the part of my work where I'm talking about tourism and travel, right? And so there's and even in my methodological sort of array, and one of the things that I did was to do focus groups with upper middle class gay black men. And where can you have discussions with upper middle class gay black men but at brunch? Which happened to be a really wonderful way to talk about travel. And to talk about where you've been, why did you go there, what did you do when you were there, who did you do when you were there, and what sort of imaginations did you have before you came with that? So this notion of one of the things one of the reasons that I call this here and there, I'm going back and forth here and there, is to talk about the production of self through a constant back and forth. Right? So one of the ways that a sort of upper middle class black gay self is produced is by having been to. We used to, in colonialism, we used to talk about people who had been to the continent, right? But there's a way in which now, if you've not been to Brazil, then, but 10 years ago that might have been the Dominican Republic. But why the reasons that you go there to use those resources and have those relationships is a production of self, and that production of self should not be confused with one form of Black solidarity that is transparent, right? And I think that's one of the connections to this work, and again, depending upon some of the work that Jackie Brown and others have done before, and thinking through diaspora as relationality.
Rich. Oh, microphone.
Is he running?
He's ready. Yeah.
Thank you, guys. I was really struck by the connections between all your papers, which are incredible. And I'm thinking about this moment of like Imagine Futures being a new moment in African diaspora studies, right? And I'm thinking about all the three of you are saying the problem of writing about the here, from there, the limits of social preparing symbolism, the kind of challenge of the vestibular in this about personhood and things like that. And I'm wondering how this is a politics that's about post-civil rights malaise, right? About the ongoing struggle for incorporation, psychic and otherwise. And I'm also thinking about something kind of radical, but it's not radical, it's because Baldwin, which is radical, but no one reads them anymore, it seems. When he says to Faulkner,
Everybody up here reads
no, I know. Don't look at me like that. No. I'm speaking from a certain. No, I hear you. Let me say what I'm saying. So, like, in Baldwin says in Faulkner and Desegregation that he begins that by saying Faulkner had promised to go into the streets and shoot Negroes because the South was thrown off balance by integration, right? And he says any real change implies the breakup of the world as one has always known it, the loss of all that gave one an identity, the end of safety. And so what I hear all three of you doing is like talking about Black kind of, the quest for Black kind of inclusion in the national narrative and holding on to a kind of social being, a cultural being that's kind of whole. But also, is Baldwin's proposition that any real change involves this breakup, this transformation, that's not about nibbling on the edges, either litigious or otherwise, right? So how do we get to a place, is what I'm asking, about these imagined futures, this new alternative grammar, which is not unlike anything. So Alondra wouldn't have to be polite then, right? You know, in front of these 200 people, you might say something radical and transformational because the stakes are so high. So that's what I'm asking about. What does real change mean, not only for African American studies, but for Black people post-civil rights? If that makes any sense.
It makes a lot of sense. And one of the things that I was thinking about this post-civil rights malaise is I'm also not just talking about the U.S. Right. So there's also a post-colonial malaise happening also. And I think that what's happening with my thinking and my hopes and my data, see I said the word data, social science, conflict, and they did in my first book also, right? But I went right on, I went right on constantly with my utopic vision, and was honest about what was on the ground with my utopic vision. And so in this book, one of the things that I'm also doing is looking at some of the, and I hear Alondra talking about this when she's talking about not necessarily the politics that we imagine are the Black politics, but what's happening, what's really happening. And one of the things that's happening for my subjects is incorporation into an old order that is not the utopic vision that some of us have hoped for or seen. It is people who are in various places. So, for example, an artist's vision of a place where she has not been, but she is imagining this in a way that people from that place cannot agree with. It is international human rights workers landing at the Hilton on some island and trying to talk with people on the ground who already have a project, right? And people who already have a project on the ground whose project is incorporation into that nation, not fighting against particular things, but and in really strategic ways, in moments where you can see glimmers of a particular, another sort of radical future, but in many ways, that this malaise leading toward people having really small practices that's not necessarily about the breakup of the order, or acting as if it is already broken up, right? So maybe this is already post Baldwin's notion of the breakup. We can certainly think about that in the Caribbean and in Richard Eiton's notion of a duty state, right? And so what happens when you have a state that's not a state, or in this country you have the police powers of the state, but you don't have the welfare powers of the state. That's a breakup. That's a failure that is post the post civil rights movement. So I think what I'm seeing from these visions is that and the complexity of this is that it's not the 90s moment or even the early 2000 movement where in my dissertation I saw resistance everywhere and named all of it in beautiful glittering detail until then having to confront Sadia Hartman and Kathy Cohen in the pages and saying, but at this moment I'm seeing a refining of these to say, well, this is what we have, and given what we have, we can still have these utopic visions, but we can't really plot the next moments until we see what's actually on the ground.
Just say two things really quickly about that. And one is, I think that there's always been this sort of deep ambivalence towards politics of inclusion and incorporation, right? And so if we read back historically, there's, and so you see it as, you see it in moments where it appears as though people can't decide how they think. What are you? Are you a social welfare Democrat? Are you a Marxist? Are you a nationalist? Right? But I think that there's a kind of flexibility in the traditions, and I think that's transnationally that we often fail to attend to in the way that we try and discipline the stories, both in terms of the formal story or the public narrative, but also sometimes in the academic narrative, right? And I'm guilty of that too. I think that this is something that happens, that's a part of what it means, the difficulty of what we do. And as a result, I guess I think that, that means that we can always, the past always lends itself to following different pathways in terms of storytellings to emerge in the present moment and to try to think about where do we go from here. And so, right, so I guess I think less in terms of that there's something about being sort of post-colonial, post-civil rights that necessarily changes the approach, but I think that we have to be, that what the challenge is the re-narration that enables us to draw on the resources that we need to confront the present moment, right? To develop the kind of political imaginary that,
There's one question over here. I don't think we're going to have time, so why don't we hear all three questions and then try to respond. So okay. First question
It'll
here.
Be quick.
Yeah.
Thank you for this mind-boggling presentation. Every one of you just brought so much new information to me, and I'm particularly interested in Professor Allen's presentation with your approach and your methodology to speak to students at Morehouse, distant, electronically, on the topic of sexuality, gender, and you're going up against a lot of tradition. Farah, you talks about Benjamin Mays in your book and the letter that was gone down, trying to get some information. Now, I'm just wondering, this is just an inquiry, in terms of policy, and the syllabus that your students were helping to bring new information in. And you said you were going to hold it until you see where it was going to go. And in terms of making it a policy. Now, there are some very strict policies at Morehouse Institution. We all know that.
Okay.
You wrote one about changing the policy. Now, there's a policy about dressing that came up about 3 or 4 years ago, and my students are
going to ask you
what
to
would you
just,
do?
yeah. Good.
How are you going to change those policies?
Okay. So the
How
Morehouse
are you going to change policies at Morehouse?
policy change.
Can you do it?
and the tradition against come up. Yeah. So we'll get all 3 questions. Emily. Oh no. Okay. Doesn't matter.
Hi, thank you. Emily Lordy. I teach at UMass. Come out of this department, however. So what I appreciate about all of your papers is just your incredible ways of offering us new methodologies, among other things, and new ways of knowing what we thought we knew. As a literary and cultural critic, my question is for Imani, and I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more about, or a little bit about how you see some of the artists that you're working on, Toni Morrison, Wangechi Mutu, as offering us something that is less about representation, which I agree with you, it's time to be more skeptical of, and more about this beautiful phrase, invitation into the disorders of desire.
Great. So question for Imani, representation, Jafari, Morehouse policy change. Yes.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Marcus Hunter. I'm an assistant professor at Yale. More importantly, for today, I was a graduate from the AFIAM program as an undergraduate. And I want to say, oh, thanks. So I wanted to say first, many thanks to the organizers for what is a beautiful panel, both in the morning session and the afternoon. I look forward to Elizabeth's keynote. And it reminded me a lot of a class I had to take with Dr. Marable called Black Intellectuals. And for me, all of you sat up there like Black intellectuals today. And why that class was important was because, one, Professor Marable knew every book there ever was written ever by a Black person, and you were like in class, like you cannot fake that you read this book because he knows them personally and he's read all of these books. And what he often, so that year I took the class, he had a edited volume come out, Dispatches from the Ebony Tower, which has been completely instructive for me as a social scientist who studies Black people, particularly because he argues that the Black intellectual tradition has been corrective, descriptive, and prescriptive. But what I heard from each of the 3 panelists today was what I might call transformative. And I'm wondering, you know, each of you referenced something from our Black past, as it were, to express a Black future. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more about who you're addressing and where you're pivoting forward from.
Those are such excellent questions. Yeah, that was the perfect last question to ask. So, all right.
That's the perfect last question, and sort of my entire project, right? Is to speak to particular audiences. If you get it, you get it. And if you get it, you get it. I was trained in anthropology to speak to anthropologists, social cultural anthropologists, right? But my experience was different here. That is, if I brought up Frederick Douglass and Fermat and W.E.B. Du Bois in my graduate courses here, and people had not read them and thought that it was completely ridiculous for me to even mention those, right? And so this book is about writing in a Black tradition, literary, high and low, and everyday, that is transnational, but that some people may not get, which gives me tremendous pleasure. It gives me tremendous pleasure to open up an essay with a poem that I was made to learn when I was 9 years old. That still means a lot to me. It gives me great pleasure to remix the words of Essex Hemphill and Audre Lorde into one sort of thing at the end, right? And so that's precisely the project. And one of the reasons that the meditation is called IRAAS-AAADSColumbiaU is because this is, I argue in part of the book, that what many of us who are now rereading Delusion, Guattari, and talking about rhizomatic methodology, may not recognize that we black folks have been doing this sort of mixing and sort of underground work for quite a long time, and so this is a way to make it visible in another way. And the Morehouse question is that it's already happening. These children are letting them have it day after day after day at Morehouse. And they're so beautiful, and some of them are watching. Hey, how y'all? And I would ask you if you want to know what's happening at Morehouse right now. Just this past week, the Morehouse Tiger issued a special issue called the Body Issue, where they have students from all over the AUC talking about body image, health, sexuality, hair, etc., in really frank and wonderful ways, and some of them are naked, which is something that hasn't happened before and could not have happened before this very moment, where these students are just pushing the envelope. I'll just very briefly say there's one of the things in the attire policy is that one is not to wear grills or saggy pants. It's a perfect storm of black anxieties about gender and class all at the same time. It really is the perfect storm of it. And one of the brothers from Safe Space, Jamal, talked about just this week on Facebook the fact that he was wearing a head wrap to class, wrapped like a gaylet, and was told by a professor that he couldn't wear that because it was a hat. He said, well, it's not a hat, it's fabric. And then it's like, oh, well, it's not a hat, well, that's women's attire. Well, absolutely not. If you see these Sikh men also wear head wraps. Black people wear head wraps all over the world. So this is the level of war position. It's very grumpy. War position happening on the ground on Morehouse that is startling. I did not believe it until I saw it myself. And so all this stuff and I could feel the stress about, oh, how y'all gonna do it? It's done. They're doing it.
So I have a habit of always talking about my home, and I thought I was going to get away with not talking about home today, but I will. But I come from, I'm originally from Birmingham, Alabama, and it's a place where people who are severely mentally ill or severely disabled are not necessarily put away. And not necessarily, yeah, and often are not, and are present and are engaged members of our communities and families and lives. And so when I read a character like Pilate in Song of Solomon or Alice Knight in The Unknown World, and they are those who are classified as disabled or strange, right? And they are the guides. It's not the men who are the property holders who are the guides. They are literally remapping. Or I have a part where I read sort of medical charts, that show the body in a very kind of normalized fashion over and against. One gets you YouTube paintings, right, which shows geography of bodies in very different ways, right? So to think about, so really it's using the creative as philosophical work, really, because I see it as a guide for us to think about, well, how do we apply this kind of approach to what it means to be political thinkers in the world in which we live, what it means to be fair. So that's kind of.
So just briefly, I'll try to answer Marcus's question. So this particular book is for a trade press, so the audience thing is, who am I addressing is, I think a broader audience than academics. But I also I hope that people who are not interested in African American studies or Black studies are enough interested in genetic ancestry testing and the social life of DNA that they'll read the book and vice versa. So I'm hoping to trap both, these kind of constituencies who might not think that they would be interested. And I think that, I don't know how to write about this work without invoking, the intellectuals and the activists that came before. So I don't know how to, there could be a way to write, for example, the reparations chapter that starts with just this case, but I have to write about Queen Mother Moore, and I have to write about 40 Acres and a Mule and I don't know, that's just, but that also means, because I want these other audiences, there's this work of translation that any of us that do interdisciplinary work always have to do. So I do. I mean, I think that the person, the agent for this book, actually said to me, she was helping me with the proposal, and she said, Alondra, you can't sell the no. So all the chapters were like, they tried to use the DNA and it doesn't work, and then they tried to use the DNA and it doesn't work. And she was like, no one wants to read these stories that kind of don't pan out. But but your point about pivoting forward is that, to me, it's about the ingenuity of the Black freedom struggle, right? It's just like, we're going to take, we've got these new tools. So 2003, by 2002, people are talking in the press about Rick Kittle's company, but it doesn't get formed until 2003. And by 2004, it's in an appellate court. And I actually just think that's fascinating. And I think that it's about the kind of don't give up of the Black freedom tradition, and about, being open to new strategies, but I also think about being open to new topics and subjects and Black studies, and about looking at these things.
Join me in thanking these wonderful scholars.